That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
It's time for another episode of Romero. Resident Evil.
Resident Evil and George Romero. When you think of the two of them together, it just makes sense. What should have been a headshot to a zombie's head was instead a slow, miserable descent into the bowels of a zombie's anus. How did George Romero even become involved with Resident Evil? That's what we're here to talk about today, so let's do it. In 1968, George Romero directed Night of the Living Dead. It redefined horror and created the modern concept of what we know today as zombies. Fast forward to Japan in 1989, a game called Sweet Home was released by Capcom. Sweet Home was an RPG dealing with ghosts that took place in a scary mansion. It was an early example of a game genre known as survival horror. For those of you who don't know, survival horror is a genre of video games that is horror-based that focuses on making the player feel less in control. In 1993, Shinji Mikami was asked to remake Sweet Home. As the work on the remake continued, it was eventually scrapped. What became of that project was an entirely new IP, which would later be dubbed
Biohazard.
Later renamed
Resident Evil.
For its Western release. Resident Evil was released in 1996 for the PlayStation 1. What follows is the story of Resident Evil, the video game. The main characters of Resident Evil are Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine. Jill and Chris are members of the Raccoon City Police Department's STARS unit, which is kind of like a special forces for police departments. STARS has two different units, Alpha and Bravo. Jill and Chris are members of Alpha Team. Bravo Team is considered MIA at the beginning of the game when contact is lost with them. So the Alpha Team is dispatched to the last known location of the Bravo Team. Chris and Jill are joined by their team leader Albert Wesker and fellow STARS member Barry Burton. The team makes it to the last known location of Bravo, but they're attacked by zombie dogs. In the ensuing confusion, they make their way to a nearby abandoned mansion. Once inside the mansion, this is where you take control of either Chris or Jill, and then the rest of the team goes missing. As you progress through the game, you will have to survive encounters with all kinds of evil monstrosities. This is where we get the influence of George Romero, because the most numerous enemies in the game are Romero zombies, but they are the least of your worries. You will also have to contend with zombie dogs, zombie sharks, a giant snake, a giant plant, and the genetically engineered bioweapons known as hunters. As you make it further into the game, you eventually discover that the mansion is a cover for a secret weapons lab run by the pharmaceutical giant Umbrella. You learn that they have developed a virus known as the T-virus, which they have used to create bioweapons. When the virus is used on different organisms, it has different effects. For example, when used on humans, it turns them into zombies. By the end of the game, you reach the final lair and learn that team leader Albert Wesker is actually a double agent working for Umbrella. He is later killed by the game's final boss, Tyrant. Tyrant is a super soldier BOW that you must defeat in order to beat the game. When you finally manage to kill Tyrant, you can make your escape from the mansion just in time to reach the helicopter before the mansion explodes. And that's the end of the game. Resident Evil was a huge hit for the original PlayStation 1. It would end up selling over 2.7 million copies. The game was also critically acclaimed at the time of its release. That being said, the game did have some notable problems, most notably being that the US version was actually harder than the Japanese version. Why was the game made harder for its US release? This was done to appease the video game rental industry. Their thought process behind this was if the game is harder, people are going to have to rent it more in order to beat it, which means they're going to get more money. But the most glaring issue was the voice acting.
And Jill, here's a lockpick. It might be handy if you, the master of unlocking, take it with you.
Regarded as some of the worst voice acting in a video game ever, Resident Evil managed to be horrifying in more ways than one. Following the success of Resident Evil, Capcom announced that they would be making a sequel to Resident Evil, Resident Evil 2. This is where George Romero comes into the picture. In 1998, as Capcom was nearing the completion of Resident Evil 2, they hired George Romero to make them 2 commercials that would air exclusively in Japan. You might be asking, why George Romero? Well, he was a heavy influence on the series and he had commercial making experience. In his early days, he made many commercials to try and get experience. Now, let's check out the commercials.
Biohazard 2. Biohazard 2.
All I have to say is I love these commercials. They are awesome. A lot of people feel that these commercials are actually better than any of the films, and I would agree 100%. Mostly because there's no Alice anywhere in these fucking commercials, and that's a positive.
My name is Alice.
Would you mind fucking off? Because your day is coming, ass clown. While producing the commercials, Capcom also produced a short documentary about the making of the commercials. In the spirit of Romeroween, I thought we could just briefly talk about this documentary. These 2 commercials were shot in Los Angeles at the Lincoln Heights jail. The cost of the commercials was $1 million US. One weird side note is that one of the commercials actually credits George Romero as the director, which you almost never see in commercials. The director of photography was Peter Deming. He had previously worked on such projects like Evil Dead 2, Twin Peaks 2017, My Cousin Vinny, and The Love Guru for some reason. The makeup effects for the zombies were done by Screaming Mad George. He had previously worked on Big Trouble in Little China, The Predator, and Mark Hamill in The Guyver. Now, let's take a look at the actors. Claire Redfield is played by Adrienne France. She primarily does soap operas, which I know fuck all about, so we're just gonna move on. Leon Kennedy is portrayed by Brad Renfro. His claim to fame was starring in The Client and Art Pupil. Leaving the production and actors behind, why don't we find out what George Romero thought about this production?
It's fabulous. I mean, I love making the movies, and it's great that there's a game which is, it's like a flashback to that genre, and it's, I can feel maybe a little bit like I had some influence on it, and so I feel very flattered,
Jeez, you want to talk about a humble guy? A little bit of influence on them? Let's just say that the makers of Resident Evil should be kissing the ground that you are walking on. Because without your zombies, who knows if Resident Evil would have even been successful? After producing the commercials, Romero would be asked by Capcom to write the screenplay for Resident Evil the movie. So in 1999, he got down to business and started writing the script. Romero had no familiarity with the game, so he asked his secretary to play the game and record the footage. Romero would then view these tapes and begin his writing process. Romero's script was based more on the game, as opposed to the 2002 Resident Evil movie, which used very little from the games. Now, I did read Romero's script for Resident Evil, and I will tell you that it was decent. It's not the usual type of zombie movie that Romero made, as it lacked any of his trademark social commentary or comedy, but for a video game adaptation, it was pretty good. The following is a brief summary of Romero's version of what Resident Evil would have been like if he had made it. We are introduced to our first character, Chris, who is not a cop, not a member of STARS, has eagles for friends, and is part Mohawk Indian for some reason. So not being a cop, what is his job? Well, he happens to be a farmer. He's also in a romantic relationship with Jill Valentine, which is not present in the game. Neither is the Mohawk Indian thing or him being a farmer. The story takes place in Raccoon City, PA. So getting into the story, there is an accident at a mansion in the Arklay Forest. While sleeping, Jill receives notice from her superiors she's needed for action. But in this version, they're not cops, they're some sort of government special forces unit. Meanwhile, her boss, Albert Wesker, and Barry Burton order Raccoon City to be evac'd. Side note, Barry Burton is changed from a Caucasian ginger to a African American. Chris wakes up and can't find Jill. He escapes the city and makes it to his farm, but there he finds nothing but death and destruction. He finds his farmhand Rake and all of his horses dead, but that's when one of the horses starts to rise from the dead and become a zombie horse. Chris has to shoot it and put it down for good. I have to admit, I've never heard of a zombie horse, but it sounds really fucking cool. We cut back to the mansion where Albert Wesker and his team arrive. They find no evidence of Jill or her team. They are presumed dead. We are then introduced to the rest of the team. Rebecca Chambers, Joseph Frost, Richard Aiken, Kenneth Sullivan, and Forrest Speyer, all of who are in the original game. Forrest Speyer is actually worth mentioning because if you read the script, he is described, and I'm quoting, as a wiry William Dafoe type. What the fuck does that even mean? There is one character that I forgot to mention, and it's an original character created by Romero himself called Vasquez.
Have you ever been mistaken for a man?
No. Have you?
Okay, that's not her name, but she might as well be. She's a fucking ripoff of Vasquez. Anyways, the character's name is Rosie Rodriguez. She is described in the script as being, and I quote, a tough-built babe, whatever that's supposed to mean. She even has a catchphrase, can you believe that? Yeah, her catchphrase is, "We live here now." But seriously, did he actually think that that was gonna be like hip and cool to say? I mean, did he assume it was gonna be the tagline for the movie? Could you imagine that? Resident Evil, we live here now. Yeah, I'm pretty sure this would end up on no merch, ever. As the group is investigating outside of the mansion, they are attacked by a group of zombie dogs. In the ensuing fracas, Joseph Frost is killed by the dogs. Wesker and the team get into the mansion and try to find safety. Chris, who had been shadowing the group, is also attacked by the dogs, but manages to get into the mansion via another entrance. Albert Wesker then reveals why the team is here, to extract Dr. John Marcus and get the T-Virus. Fast forwarding a bit, Jill is revealed to be alive and she reunites with Wesker and the group. After another squad member is bitten by a zombie, the team demands answers. Wesker explains that Marcus works for a company known as Umbrella, which financed the work on the T-Virus. It's also revealed that the virus is passed through the bite. You die from the bite and come back as the animated dead. Speyer explains it's like Night of the Living Dead. Romero just couldn't help himself, could he? The group continues on and they eventually run into Chris. Sort of. Chris had been crawling through the air ducts when the air ducts broke and he falls into a tank of water containing zombie sharks. Jill shoots the glass out and the sharks are freed. They manage to kill the sharks, but in doing so, it sets off the containment breach and now they're stuck. Wesker confronts Chris about what he's doing there, and Jill confirms that Chris was part of her cover story. Chris admits to following them. They find Marcus's corpse and they realize that the mission was a failure. Wesker then says it's their job to contain the outbreak and they must get the antidote. Chris mentions that there's a crawl space they can use to get to the floors below. Everybody agrees and they get moving. From here, the groups get split into two. The first group is Chris, Rebecca, Aiken, and Sullivan, and they end up in a greenhouse where Plant 42 is stored. Sullivan is killed by being sucked dry by the plant. Chris kills Plant 42 by electrocuting it. Aiken is killed by a giant snake that had been hiding in the corpse of the giant plant. Chris manages to kill the snake by throwing a hand grenade down its throat. Meanwhile, back with Wesker's group, they are attacked by a bunch of hunters. Speyer, aka William Dafoe, is killed by one. Chris and his group show up and they all make their escape and they eventually run into Ada Wong, one of the few scientists remaining alive. Ada Wong is an important character from Resident Evil 2. The group finally makes it to the secret lab, but when they get there, Wesker double-crosses them. Wesker's true intention was to come to this lab and steal the data disk on the BOW codenamed Tyrant. He's not even working for Umbrella, he just plans on selling it to the highest bidder. From there, the group turns on him, the bomb timer is set, and they only have 15 minutes to escape the mansion. Ada Wong grabs the Tyrant data and flees. The others follow suit. Wesker gets his arm caught in the door, leaving him and Barry behind. Barry tries to kill Wesker, but Wesker manages to free his arm and shoot Barry in the gut. Tyrant manages to kill Barry. Then Tyrant kills Wesker by impaling him. The fleeing group of characters finally makes it to the top of the mansion. Chris destroys the Tyrant disc, and Rosie sacrifices herself when Tyrant breaks free from the lab and comes after them. The group makes it out of the mansion and successfully flags down one of the helicopters. With Tyrant hot on their heels, Chris manages to get one of the pilots to throw him an RPG. He uses it to finally finish off Tyrant. Chris, Rebecca, Jill, and Ada all manage to climb the ladder to the helicopter and then are lifted to safety. The helicopter takes off at full speed, narrowly missing the mansion exploding. And that's the end. Time to fade to black. And that was George Romero's script for Resident Evil. I would have to say it was pretty damn good. If they'd actually gone ahead and greenlighted this project, it might have been one of the best video game adaptations ever. So, how did Capcom reward Romero for all of his hard work? They fired him. And according to Romero, and I quote, "They just didn't like my script, man." He also stated, and I quote, "I don't think that they were into the spirit of the video game and wanted to make more of a war movie, something heavier than I thought it should be. So, I think they just never liked my script." Capcom producer Yoshiki Okamoto explained to the editors of Electric Gaming Monthly that Romero's script wasn't good, so Romero was fired. Capcom also believed that fans would feel that the film had been altered too much from the game and that newcomers would dislike the premise, which, when you think of it, makes no fucking sense. Sure, Romero changed some things. I question why Chris was changed from a cop to a farmer and he's a Native American with eagle friends, but the heart and spirit of Resident Evil was still there. Paul Anderson stated that the movie would have no video game tie-ins, which is pretty shitty when you think about it. Resident Evil 2002 is so far from the source material, it's not even funny. And there's one major reason for this.
My name is Alice.
Yeah, fucking Alice. She's the reason why these movies suck. There's this whole catalog of characters that you could pick from, and you just make up a new one because, why not? I guess we'll never know what Romero could have done with Resident Evil, but it's fun to be able to read his script and imagine what could have been, because honestly, what he would have done would have been 1,000 times better than what we got. Maybe we wouldn't have gotten 6 films, but did we really need 6 Resident Evil fucking films? So, till next time.
Barry, you're so optimistic.
Hey, it's up to us to take out Umbrella.
Feed me.